Yeah, I know I'm late. Darling in the Franks ended in July. This is October, almost November. But I had to speak my mind about this series because I don't believe this is what everyone has to say about it. And not because the things that have been said are wrong, but because those things were things that the story didn't pay attention to anyway. The first thing I want to say is that you're just being unfair with Darling in the Franks. You're complaining about things that you wouldn't complain about in any other anime. Starting with the supposed world building problems, the majority of these are regarding the episode 19, an episode that I personally think is pretty bad, but somehow you've managed to complain about the things that were well written in that episode. The main complaint is that they don't use sociopolitics and socioeconomics in a realistic way. And there's not even a point here. The series doesn't want to talk about it because it's not the theme of the series. They're just telling how the world ended in that way. If instead of overlooking those things, they were to explain them deeply, as you ask, then you could complain about how they didn't explain the different political strategies in every continent, and then the different political strategies in every country, because you can always ask for more information. So they just overlook it to get to the point they want to talk about, and not the sociopolitics and the socioeconomics. And the second supposedly issue in this episode or in the world building is the magma, which by the way in the series is not molten rocks, it's like a new resource made out of Klaxeser, but it doesn't matter. I'm gonna explain to you why it wouldn't matter if it were molten rocks. So now, talking about the real theme of the series, which is science fiction, so the same explanation as before doesn't apply. But science fiction is about exploring the consequences of imaginary science and technology. The fucking consequences, not the science itself. If we were to explain the science of imaginary science, it makes a loop. It goes nowhere. It has no sense because in science an answer only causes more questions, and we would have to explain those new questions. That's why it is imaginary science. And with that said, I don't mean you can criticize Darling's world building. I'm saying that you can criticize it for not being accurate to real life. But, in my opinion, I think it uses pretty well its resources, because it takes all the elements that were presented to us in the beginning of the series and links them to the world that we live. It starts with the discovery and extraction of magma, that first is a great energy source, so it replaces the other energy sources, and obviously the ones with control over it get political power. Secondly, magma is a great base material, so it develops best technology. They call Dr. Franks to discover the immortality. And with literally the elixir of immortality and all the energetic resources, it's no wonder that governments start giving up political power to Abe. Then the abuse of the extraction of magma ends up desertifying the earth. So, who's better fit to give shelter than the ones with technological and energetic resources and support from the government? So now, literally controlling the space where everyone lives, it's reasonable that they end up in the place they are. And finally, the Klaxesers appear, so they need a response to it. And that's when comes the Franks and the Parasites, and it's basically the beginning of the series. And with that said, the time between one event and the other is unrealistically short because the Dr. Franks live in the pre-apocalyptical world and made it to the post-apocalyptical world without taking the immortality treatment. So, I think it's understandable. And yes, you could have saved all those explanations just by placing the events in other world, in other galaxy, in a fantastic world, but later it will make a parallelism between plantation society, Claxosapien society, and our society, so it gives more meaning to the message. So as I said in the beginning, the problem with this episode is the episode itself. It doesn't present a bad science fiction world, it just presents it in a really bad way. The next thing I want to address is Darling in the Franxx uses of tropes. Much has been said about how Darling copies, and I want to emphasize in copies, Gainax and Trigger previous series. In my opinion, this isn't even a complaint, and I'm gonna tell you a story to explain you why. In the beginning of the 15th century, in Italy there was a popular tale about two lovers with a tragic destiny. A guy called Masuccio Salernitano in 1476 uses that tale to make a short story, this time naming the two lovers by Mariotto and Gianzola. 60 years later, Luigi da Porto was inspired by Salernitano and made another tragic romance in form of a novel, changing the name of the lovers to Romeo and Giulietta and moved the setting to Verona. 30 years later, Matteo Bandello would take da Porto's work and made a poem, and not many years later Arthur Brooke would translate that poem, adding lots of details of English poetry, and changing the name to the tragical history of Romeo and Juliet. And at this point, you know who's gonna come, William Shakespeare took all the principal elements of this book to create Romeo and Juliet in 1595. So, as you can see, to anyone that had read all these works, Romeo and Juliet would have been very predictable, with a structure over-repeated, typical plot points. Where I want to get is that we have to look at Darling as a series by itself, because when it copies an element from previous Gainax and Trigger series, it doesn't just repeat it, it creates a new meaning. For example, in Evangelion, the Evas are made out of angels to talk about the fragility of the humans and the AT field. But in Darling, the Claxosaurs represent the downfall of the Claxosapien, so using them means that they are taking a similar path of self-destruction. It uses the same resource to accomplish a totally different goal. Because like Shakespeare, what matters is not what you use, but how you use it. And knowing this, I understand that this repetition bothers people, because it feels predictable. But at this point, I take it like a Trigger signature, the way they feel that they can squeeze everything out of their stories. Because you can use a structure repeated for 5 centuries and still make a masterpiece.
For a small fee in America.